ready to go? We'll let people get in here because we have one of the best talks for last.
And let's make this interesting.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation. I was just telling Dave, I didn't even prepare any questions because I know any conversation with him is going to be interesting. But I will give him a sort of introduction. So this is George David Banks, but we just call him Dave Banks.
It's a Southern thing. Go by your middle name.
And so Dave Banks is an economist, a political analyst, a policy advocate who has been focusing on climate change, energy, trade, and he serves as a policy advisor to the Climate Leadership Council, Center for Climate and Trade, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Atlantic Council, focusing all on foreign policy and climate policy. He recently served as the chief strategist for the Republican side of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Previously, he was a special assistant for international energy and environment at the National Economic and National Security Councils in the White House. He was Republican Deputy Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and he was a senior White House advisor on international affairs and climate change. And so that's a big list of things. So this one,
both Republican administrations.
Both Republican administrations.
You seem to be hiding that.
I think it was pretty clear you're a Republican.
Okay.
I think it's pretty clear. And Dave's kind of a smart guy. He might not appear to be, but he is. I'll tell you.
As I tell people, if you're good, you don't have to look good.
Exactly. It's doubly true for you, right? And I
perfected it.
I will tell a little anecdote. A year or two ago, I was at a reception for some senators receiving some awards for working on clean energy and talking about some of these policies we'll talk about tonight. And Senator Kramer was up there getting an award, and they were, lauding his leadership. And Senator Kramer said, I have the best staff in the world. I have Dave Banks. And I don't know if you deserve that, but he seemed to think it.
Well, I wasn't working for him.
I know, that's the funny part. He was not working for the center at the time. And so with that introduction, let's kick it off. And Dave can kind of tell us a little bit about how he got involved in climate and trade and policy and maybe just all kinds of things. Because I didn't even mention you worked for the CIA, did things like that.
These lights remind me of that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So let's get into it.
Yeah, so I get this question. I consider myself as a Republican climate activist, and believing that Republican conservative principles are much more effective at reducing global emissions than, say, European and our friends over on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats. I think that there's a huge need for Republicans to be engaged on this topic, because I think Republicans do bring in kind of a sense of realpolitik, how the world works. I think a lot of my Democrat friends, they're a little bit on the idealistic side about how things should work instead of how things actually work, but God bless them, and I love them, and I like working with them. But, I get
We are a nonpartisan organization.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And I didn't just say that because you're a nonpartisan organization.
Yes.
I meant it from my heart.
I know.
Anyway, so people will ask me the question, well, how did you get involved in climate change? What really brought you to it? And well, it's kind of not to get into a whole lot of details, but this is like 20 years ago, and I was about to be posted in the State Department to Brussels at the U.S. mission in the EU. And I was going to be political officer in the last few weeks. They said, no, we're going to send you to the economic section, and you're going to work on environment policy. Well, I had come from the CIA, and I didn't know anything about environment policy, and I was like, well, okay. And I'm there now this is during the Bush administration, so keep in mind that this was just a few years after President Bush pulled the U.S. out of the Kyoto process, for those of you who remember the Kyoto Protocol. So there was essentially, I don't want to call it a Cold War, but no real relationship or ongoing discussion between the EU and the US on climate change, period. Lots of bad blood there. So I'm there for a few weeks, and the European Parliament decides we're going to do this big event on climate change policy, and we're going to ask the US ambassador to come over and talk about this George W. Bush's climate policy and explain to them, what we're doing. And the ambassador said, no, that's okay. And he gives it to the deputy chief of mission and which is called the DCM. The DCM goes, it's okay. And then he sends it to the economic minister counselors in charge of the economic section. He goes, yeah, I'll pass it. And he gives it to my direct boss on, the head of the environment unit. He goes, no. He calls me in. He says, Dave, I got a great opportunity for you. I was like, yeah? He's like, how would you like to present U.S. climate policy to the European Parliament? I'm like, well, I don't know anything about climate change policy. He's like, that's okay. He was like, just call the State Department, and they'll give you all the talking points that you need. Well, the State Department, crickets, would not give me anything. And so there was this is dating me. So Google was still kind of new. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to Google the U.S. climate position. So I came up with some notes like this. And I come into the European Parliament. This is huge, vast room. It looked like something out of the Harry Potter movies. And and lo and behold, hundreds and hundreds, probably over 1,000 people were in this room, right? And they have this mic and they just hand it to me and say, here you go. And wow. So I go through my points, and by the way, I couldn't even tell you if my points were correct or not.
So what you're saying is, so this is not an intimidating audience for you?
No, not at all.
Yeah, good to go.
So I give the points, deliver the points as well as I can, and hundreds of hands come up for the Q&As. And I'm like, oh my God, this is an ambush. And sure enough, because these parliamentarians had not had any real interaction with the U.S. government in at least probably since the Clinton administration, and had lots of questions, and it was brutal. I couldn't even tell you what questions that they posed to me, but what are you really doing? Why did you pull out of Kyoto? Oh, lots of tough questions. I really didn't have a really good handle on this climate change is a real problem. Do you agree with it? All those kind of questions. And so I wrap up, I walk out of the Parliament, and I'm like, I'm going to get them back for this. I'm going to become a specialist on climate change policy and help design a U.S. policy that works for Republicans, and I'm going to get those Europeans back. And here you are. Then I got addicted to it, as all you have. You're all addicted to the fight, to the crusade. And once you realize how big, how important of a challenge and a problem it is, you're stuck. And so it's been now 20 years for me plus, and I haven't regretted it since.
Well, let's get into kind of following on that story. Let's talk about why trade and climate. Why is trade such a vital opportunity when it comes to addressing climate?
Well, so this comes back to, how do you construct a policy, a climate policy that works for Republicans? And look, I mean, the narrative out there, and it has some credibility, coming from the Kyoto Protocol, is that any kind of international climate engagement that the U.S. engages in is fraught with peril, right? That any kind of agreement, any kind of climate policy would be unfair to the United States, that would undermine U.S. competitiveness and harm our manufacturing and labor. I mean, that's kind of the traditional Republican view. Certainly, George W. Bush had that. Donald Trump clearly was there. I mean, Trump, not an ideologue on climate. I mean, he thinks it's BS, but he's not dead set against doing anything related to it. But particularly if you can construct a policy that actually improves U.S. competitiveness vis-a-vis China and a number of our other adversaries. And so this kind of brought me into the trade space because I realized, and I think as a Republican, I think Republicans just believe that the U.S. is just awesome at everything and just is so much better when it comes to producing things from an environmental informants and compliance perspective. We got the best standards in the world, and they look at our success in reducing traditional pollutants, right? Which again have been incredibly successful, and so they just assume that the U.S. is one of the most efficient producers. Period. So with that knowledge, right, then I'm, kind of started looking at, well, what kind of data do we have? And the data was pretty sparse, but what we did have showed relative carbon efficiency for the U.S. economy. Okay, so this is what's been really behind the whole idea in investing political capital and resources into developing this policy design, right, that we can pull together to get Republicans on board. And I think, look, I mean, Democrats have been very receptive and very supportive as well. And I will say this, though, when we first started pulling the data together and showing Democrats were like, this can't be true. We're just not as good as this. But I think, yeah, I mean, at this point, we certainly have good momentum and a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. Look, it's still early on for Republicans, but we definitely have some good momentum on both sides of the aisle.
I think that's good, to jump in and talk specifically about Prove It Act. I mean, our wonderful volunteers have been educating themselves on some of these issues. Prove It is one of our primary asks this lobby day. We have 1,000 citizen lobbyists going to the Hill tomorrow, meeting with, I think, upwards of 434 meetings, something like that. And so I think this is a good opportunity to give a little bit more background on Prove It, and then maybe get into a little bit about the messaging behind it. We've generally said, let's just focus on what Prove It actually does, not what it could be used for, not thinking way down the road, but keep really what's in front of us on Prove It. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, and your panel before was pretty good with giving advice. Know your audience, of course. But just to give you some context on the roots of Prove It, so there was a study. This was when I was on the House Climate Committee, and by the way, let's talk a little bit about that too, because I think that's an important data point. So when the House flipped in 2018, or let's say 2019, Democrats created the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and Republicans, this was Leader McCarthy, had to respond to that. And I think Democrats were a bit surprised because the last climate committee that they had put together, we had a climate skeptic from the Republican side as the ranking member, and I think Democrats probably thought the same thing would happen.
Yeah.
And this was around the time, by the way, especially on the Energy Commerce Committee in the House, where Republicans started shifting the way they were talking about climate. They weren't really questioning the science. They were focused on the actual policy. And when McCarthy made a decision, he didn't pick a climate skeptic. He picked my boss, Garrett Graves, who had a lot of on-the-ground experience working on adaptation policy in Louisiana when he worked for the state. But Garrett, very practical when it comes to climate policy, obviously disagrees with a lot of the policies the Democrats table, but very pragmatic and believes that it's an issue that we should address as a country. But in the context with global emission reductions, of course. So he picks Garrett to run the Republican side, and then they had to fill the team out. And so they looked at me and a friend of mine last year, I think Marty Hall, was earlier this year.
Yeah, Marty came and spoke to our conservative conference and on permitting reform. Yeah. So
yes.
We're just hitting all the old Republican staff on this issue. So
he hired Marty Hall and me to help come up with a strategy, and it wasn't so much about coming up with a climate policy that worked for a handful of Republicans, but what McCarthy wanted, he wanted a climate policy or a message around climate that would appeal to a critical mass of the conference. And what does critical mass of the conference? Well, just about everyone in the conference on climate change is needed for that critical mass number. And I think that I think if you look at where Republicans are in the House, for example, you really have three groups of folks. You have one group of folks, and I think that there's still a minority of the conference that believes that climate change is a real significant problem and that it's our responsibility to table good solutions just to solve the climate challenge. Then you have another group of Republicans who say, "Nah, I'm pretty agnostic about this. I don't know if it's real or not, but I look at the polling, I look at the politics, and it's clear that voters, and a lot of voters, younger voters, independent voters, want us to do something about climate change." And then you got the third group of Republicans who they might be climate skeptic, or they've been very opposed to climate action in the past. But they look at what Democrats have done with the Green New Deal, and AOC and Markey and that team actually kind of did us a real solid by tabling the Green New Deal, because those Republicans looked at it and was like, wow, my God, this is a big problem, and we need to address this with our own set of solutions, regardless of whether we like it or not. So you have those three groups of Republicans coming together and agreeing on the general goal, right? And I think that for me, working in climate, I really don't care where people are coming from, as long as everyone signs off on the final goal, and the goal being, we need to have a Republican message and policy guided by conservative principles that we then bring into the national and global conversation when it comes to addressing climate change. Now, I've been talking for a while, so
I know. Yeah, I think you lost
myself. I lost myself. But I think with the Prove It Act, so we're on the Climate Committee, and there was a study in 2019 that was released by the Department of Energy. It was the National Energy Technology Lab that was focused on comparing the LNG life cycle emissions of Russian pipeline gas to Europe compared to U.S. LNG shipped from the Gulf. And the numbers were pretty astounding. We had the Russian pipeline gas is 40+% more GHG intensive than U.S. LNG shipped from the Gulf to Europe. And Republicans loved it. They embraced the point. And by the way, what I have found is that when Republicans see those numbers, how much more carbon efficient the U.S. is than other economies, but particularly with the Chinese, is that they kind of naturally gravitate towards, well, this is something that we should perhaps monetize to the benefit of the United States.
Yeah, and I brought this up when I was talking last night, that we had meetings several years ago with the German embassy, and they were thinking about these issues before it came up, that maybe it is much better for meeting their climate goals to be buying natural gas from the United States rather than Russia, and they were starting to think about that in terms of like policies they wanted to put in place.
Yeah, and by the way, this is one of the major faults of sort of current climate policy, is that it's all territorial based, right? So it's about territorial emissions reductions in your own country. So what happens is that if you pursue a set of regulations to reduce emissions, well, oftentimes that industry will offshore, right, and to places that have oftentimes a dirtier production than where they came from. And so you end up having an increase in global emissions. So for example, if you just look at the US numbers, and I may not have the most current data, but if you look at the US numbers on paper, they're actually probably 10% more than what those numbers actually reflect, because we import so many carbon emissions. In the UK, that number's like 40%. In the EU, it's like 30%. So the Europeans have offshored so many of their emissions that if you include those in the numbers that they report, oftentimes you'll find that, particularly, certain EU countries have actually increased emissions compared to their baseline of 1990. So there hasn't been there hasn't been the degree of success in reducing emissions that a lot of countries claim, right? And I think this is also one of the reasons why the Europeans and the environmental community, they kind of move towards say, okay, we do need a trade policy in order to close what they call the carbon loophole, right? To reduce this effect that's actually been detrimental to the world's march toward addressing climate change.
Yeah, that offshoring of emissions has always been a great concern of ours, and that's why we've been talking about CBAMs for 15 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We can talk about CBAMs if you want as well, but
We can get that in a minute, but why don't we get, why don't we get
but on
into
Prove
like,
It. Well,
a little bit more on Prove It.
Let's talk a little bit more about Prove It. I keep going off on tangents. My apologies. But the so when this Nettle study came out and Republicans loved the numbers, we looked at it and it's like, wow, we really need a more comprehensive data set that covers more sectors of the economy. And this is where our friends at Climate Leadership Council played an extremely important role in actually running the data. They had been working on that along with their Baker-Schultz carbon dividend plan, but the trade piece and the data that they had pulled together became really valuable in sort of pitching this idea to Republican offices, because again, they look at the data and they're like, well, this is exactly what we need. We always knew we were the best. Here we are, and let's try to monetize it. Now it's again very early stages, and this is where Prove It comes in, right? Because I think and let's get into we were talking about different Republican camps earlier when it comes to climate policy. But this is also a big difference too when it comes to Prove It, because you have some Republicans who support it for, let's say, for a shield against the EU CBAM and other CBAMs coming up with data and math that would be detrimental to U.S. commercial interests. And then you have another group of Republicans who look at it and go, well, this comparative data set, and Prove It is a comparative data set, it's just not a U.S. set. This comparative data set will show how much better we are than everyone else in all these sectors, and we'll be able to use this as an argument against Democratic attempts to unilaterally impose GHG regulations on U.S. industrial emissions. And you can apply that same argument to the domestic carbon tax as well. But then there's also the forward-leaning permitting piece, right, where they say, oftentimes environmentalists will argue that this project is going to be bad for the climate or the environment. And with this comparative data set, you can argue, well, actually, that's not the case. If this project goes through and if we produce here, we're going to do it in a much cleaner way than what imports or production would occur in other places in the world. So it's about then that brings you into the next sort of step and stage into this. What do you do? How do you use this for trade?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think we've focused on enough yet. This argument, and Marty's really good about making that too, that the more stuff we produce here, we produce it cleaner. And by producing it here, we're actually lowering global emissions, not just our own.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, with the right policies
With the right
in place.
policies.
With the right policies.
And this ties into permitting reform because it makes it easier for us to build more stuff here.
Yeah. And then you look at where the Trump world is, right? So the Trump world is, I would say, or at least the Trump trade folks are much more receptive to just, using the data and monetizing it and holding foreign polluters accountable, including countries like China. Now, there's no real interest in using this as a climate policy for them, not to totally speak for them, but just my observation. They're looking at the data as just pure realpolitik. We're going to use this for U.S. commercial advantage. So that's kind of your camps there. Again, we're at a very early stage when it comes to this policy and kind of where it'll take us. I am optimistic that we're going to come up with a policy that Republicans and Democrats embrace that will hold foreign polluters accountable at some point, but we're not there yet.
So talk about, as we go to these meetings tomorrow, what advice do you have on specifically talking on Prove It? I mean, one thing we're trying not to do is link it to anything directly like a CBAM, but just on the merits of that information You want to talk to us a little bit about how you would message it going to these offices? I think I brought this up last night because it is an interesting policy, because like you say, everybody sees it a little bit differently. I'm pretty sure Bill Cassidy, Cynthia Loomis, and Chris Coons all support Prove It for different reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So again, not to state the obvious, but I mean, the vast majority of Democrats are already there when it comes to embracing the concept, right? I think that they don't necessarily know what it looks like. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's the Sheldon Whitehouse proposal that's there. I don't think there's a politically viable pathway for that because it has an implicit price on carbon. You've got the Cassidy CBAM, which I consider to be too large in any case, right? Even though it doesn't have a price on carbon associated with it. I think that for folks coming in and those who want to link Prove It to these bigger policies, just be cautious with it because again, the whole sort of idea that we're going to use this data to create some big climate and trade policy is still pretty new. And in my opinion, I don't see a U.S. if this happens, I don't see a U.S. policy design looking anything like the EU CBAM. I think that for those people who are interested in the concept and want to work with the Europeans, we are not at the same stage as the Europeans are when it comes to regulating carbon in trade. We're just not there yet. I mean, we have a lot of sectors out there, and let me explain this a bit. We have a lot of sectors out there who just don't want to be covered. We have sectors that do want to be covered in this kind of policy. And the ones who want to be covered are the countries that have been decimated by the trade regime, right? That see this type of policy as being the one lifeline that can help it survive.
You're talking like decades. Steel and things like that have really been offshored a lot. Yeah. Yeah,
steel, aluminum, domestic solar manufacturing. I think you probably have some fertilizer companies that are in that space too. Any industry that's faced a tremendous pressure from overseas competition. Period. Mm-hmm. So and then you have another group of energy-intensive manufacturers who just haven't experienced those problems, and so we're going to have to be really careful in how we talk about this. I think that for Republicans from manufacturing states, there's certainly a willingness to explore using a trade policy to hold foreign polluters accountable and to level the playing field for the United States. But I think that a lot of those people wouldn't be comfortable linking it to carbon, right? I don't think that they have a good understanding of what that looks like, and there's still a lot of, a lot of hesitancy, and I think I would say this. I think it's also a result of it's kind of a legacy issue, right? I think that even for younger Republican staff, the legacy is that Republicans oppose, Biden's climate policy, or those who have been around a bit longer, Obama's climate policy as well. And so with Trump not really having a coherent climate policy, there's not a whole lot that staff can compare Biden's policies to, right? And so it's fraught with peril. If you get into a conversation where you say, oh, this is a way for us to come up with a carbon tax. I think all of you know at this point that's not the best pitch to a Republican audience. But if you're talking about the need to Prove It, I would focus on not the trade piece. You don't want to get too far out ahead, unless you're talking to someone like Cassidy or Kramer's office, right? Folks that have kind of leaned into the policy development. But for most Republican offices, it's going to be, look, this is about comparative data to prove how much better the U.S. is at producing goods, that the more we produce here and displace abroad, the more we reduce global emissions, and that links to your permitting arguments too. I would focus on those core pieces in the average Republican office.
I think that's really good advice. And I think people should have note cards, and we'll have folks coming around, and we'll start to open it up to the audience for questions, and maybe we can go easy on Dave, or maybe not. I don't know if I want to go easy.
No,
I think
please,
I think we make
go
it
hard. Be like the European Parliament.
I know. If you can do that, you can handle this crowd. I'm without a doubt. But while we're waiting for that, is there any? I mean, I think it's really interesting just thinking about the evolution of this discussion, because this Republican need to have a climate agenda, and McCarthy was really driving a lot of that and saw the numbers like you talked about. But talk a little bit more how you saw that evolution on the Select Committee and in the conversations that are ongoing that need to have a proactive agenda and not just let one side be at the table and kind of drive it.
Right, that's good. That's a good framing of question. I think, look, I mean, McCarthy certainly saw climate as a liability for Republicans. McCarthy wanted to be Speaker of the House, and he realized that being Speaker of the House runs through the suburbs. So you have to capture enough of those suburb competitive seats. There aren't that many of those seats left, but you have to capture enough of those in order to control the House. I think currently there's maybe like 24 competitive House seats, so not that many. And it's not as if, I think that from that perspective, it's not as if you think that climate is a leading voters issue, right, for the majority of the electorate, but you recognize that it's enough of an issue for a certain group of people that can turn the election one way or the other. I mean, you got to look at some of these House races where, what was it? I think Representative Miller Meeks won her district by 6 votes.
Yeah, it was. I know it was less than 50.
And there were a number of seats that were maybe not that close, but were like in the hundreds. Mm-hmm. And so you look at the percentage of votes cast. If a number of those voters were turned off because of the climate policy, that's a problem.
Well, I think that goes to everybody I think was in the room when our friends from the Environmental Voter Project was talking about the same issue, that these margins, they might not seem big, but can have a really outsized influence. If you're talking 100 voters, 200 voters, can have a really big impact.
Yeah, the number of people in the room. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Flannery, do we have some questions ready back there?
So, by the way, to finish your question, though, I think that political reality is enough to convince enough of Republican leadership that there needs to be some type of constructive messaging around climate. So for example, I don't see the current speaker pushing back on what McCarthy did, and I don't see the next leader of the House doing the same thing. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the Senate, because I believe the Senate will flip, and the successor to McConnell, regardless of who it is going to be viewed as being a bit more practical on climate change than he was. So I think we definitely have a good sort of political direction for the GOP when it comes to climate. You may not think that the GOP is doing enough, and that's obviously an argument that one can make, but I do, just because of where the electorate is, where younger voters, I do see this shift as being something that's real.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So our first question is a tough one. Has Ben ever thought of hosting late night television on the side?
You know what, Mark, are you in here? Like, maybe that should be a good idea. Maybe I could do that. But climate's more important, right?
But over drinks.
Yes.
That'd be better.
Reuters reported last week that China plans to better measure the carbon contents of its products to go into effect in 2027. Does this news rev up the urgency for Republican members of Congress to support the Prove It Act?
So That's an interesting question. So I think most Republicans would not trust those numbers that China would table, and I don't think the Europeans shouldn't trust them either. But I think that what that does is it obviously signals what Republicans are already concerned about, and the importance of prove it, right, is that it's our own math, right? So if we know the Chinese are going to produce their own math later on, we know it's going to be flawed. We know that China is going to find loopholes and do whatever it can do in order to advantage its own industries, which I would do the same thing if I were them. But I do think it does probably strengthen the Republican argument that we need to move forward with our own math because everyone else is doing the same thing, including the Chinese.
No, I mean, I think that lack of trust and transparency in Chinese numbers has come up again and again and again in meetings. Every meeting I think I've had over the years, it always comes up, and I think it's even gotten stronger. And you might remind me, I think just recently, this year, the Chinese stopped publishing numbers about youth employment and stuff like anything that doesn't look good. They just kind of bury,
Right.
or they manipulate.
Right. I mean, and look, I mean, it's clear that if we were to have a policy design that looks like the Europeans, it would give China the ability to cheat, right? There's a lot of concern that, let's say we would have some type of CBAM, and then ask China to comply with essentially our performance or standards, whatever you want to call it. Then China would segment the market, right? China would restructure its industry where all the cleaner, they would create an actual clean industrial segment for aluminum or steel, and then ship all that to us, and then ship the rest of it elsewhere that wouldn't have the same type of policy. I think that's one of the reasons why we can't allow them to do that. So it's got to be more of a national average, in my opinion, if we do the policy. But then also, I think it really reinforces the idea that we need to figure out a way to work with our allies and partners in coming up with an international arrangement that has a common approach when it comes to China in particular.
I think that's a good point. I don't think I've ever really thought about that the way that we have the opportunity to learn from the EU CBAM and what doesn't work with it and design a better trade policy.
Yeah, my concern is that we look at the EU CBAM and go, oh, that's a failure, so we shouldn't do it. And I think a lot of Republicans fall into that trap of looking at European climate policies, and including some of the criticism over the cap and trade. But when something, and by the way, it's not just Republicans. I think a lot of people fall victim to this. When something doesn't work, they just automatically think we can't make it work, right? That we can't come up with our own strategy, our own design, our own policy that is actually much more effective than the European or other designs.
Right. Well, let's have another question.
How did the USA become so much cleaner in manufacturing, and are steps necessary to keep us from backsliding? So,
I'm probably not going to answer everything here, but obviously, our economic system rewards efficiency, it rewards innovation, it rewards companies for reducing their costs, right? So I think that the sort of the built-in advantage of a market-oriented economy produces just cleaner production. And it's just not the U.S., right? You can look at Europe, you can look at Japan. These countries are all kind of in the same ballpark as us. You have also environmental enforcement, compliance, that I would argue that we're second to none on that. And and also I think it's part of a result of having a democratic representative society that places values on a cleaner environment and regulation that produces those kind of results. I mean, it hasn't always been the case, obviously. I get in these conversations with some of my free market friends where they go, well, that's free market is simply the solution for the environment and for climate change. I'm like, well, people forget, what the United States was like 100 years ago, or even earlier, or even later than that. It doesn't automatically produce those kind of results. It's a lot more complicated than that. I don't know if you've got.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, like it's certainly you've got to have rules. You've got to have a system. You've got to have a referee to make the game work right? And so I think that is a fair assessment that you can't just remove all that stuff and make it all market based.
Right, but yes, you have to have some rules, and you have to have a market that does reward efficiency. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions here about how the data will be collected in the Prove It Act, especially with foreign countries that might not want to give that information to us willingly.
You got some good questions out here.
Hey, well, what'll make you work? I might even buy you a beer later.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah, I know.
I drink vodka, though.
I know.
Okay, all right. Then why'd you offer me beer, then?
Because I wanted to see if you'd take the beer.
Oh. This guy. Now you got me off track here. Can't remember the question.
It's getting towards the end of the day. You got one thing on your mind, right?
Hold on. Yeah. You just got me off of it. What was the thrust of that question again? Oh, prove it. Data collecting. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
I'm getting old and fat, but But I haven't totally lost my memory, short-term memory. With the data collection, look, I mean, so yes. So one of the challenges in this is that when you're doing a comparative data set, you look. Most countries don't have very good inventories when it comes to carbon or greenhouse gases. Period. There just aren't that many. And certainly, I would argue that no one is as, there might be a small country here or there, but I don't think anyone's really comparable to how well the U.S. does. The EU's close, but I don't think it's as comprehensive. The one thing that we have, and this is, I think, pretty important, is that there are a lot of, the vast majority of countries have at least decent reporting when it comes to traditional pollutants, right? So sulfur, NOx, for air quality purposes, and you can use that data in order to come up with proxies for CO2. And in fact, I think with NOx you can actually back the CO2 piece out of it. So I would imagine that there will be a number of ways to collect the comparative data set. One of which would be, again, using some of these traditional pollutant inventories for that, but also trade activity and other sort of available public reporting, right, that the Chinese control, mm-hmm. right, when it comes to manufacturing and just energy-related data, right, that can be gathered and come up with pretty good and very good estimates for CO2 and GHG as well. And then also, I think that for us, just really fast, it's obviously important for us to have a pretty transparent process in how we gather the data, so that other countries, and by the way, and that would also include other countries, sort of providing data to us as well. And I think one of the hopes with Prove It is because you would have DOE and their labs helping collect the data and conducting the study, is that they would benefit from their vast ecosystem of international partnerships that would then feed into their analysis.
One thing I do want to broach on before we wrap up for today. I mean, we got a little bit of time for questions, but one of the reasons I think we should be excited about the Prove It. I've always believed that it also serves a dual role as a coalition building tool.
Yeah.
That by bringing folks on various sides of these issues in industry together to have this conversation, we actually help build the climate conversation long term, just writ large. And I think we saw that with the Growing Climate Solutions Act, where like 5 years ago, you really couldn't talk about agriculture and climate. You kind of had to talk. You absolutely couldn't put anything in the Farm Bill that was specific to climate. But that really kind of blew open that we could talk about all these things. And I always point out that, and then like more Republicans ended up voting for that bill in the Senate than Democrats. And I feel like there are benefits to prove it on collecting that data, but that coalition building and getting people more comfortable working together on climate across the aisle is also a co-benefit of pushing for this.
So that's an
legislation.
excellent observation, and that makes up for your beer, your beer only.
I have
thing.
some uses.
No, I totally agree. I mean, look, the more data, the more facts you have out there, the more it will inform people, and the more it'll produce a rational conversation around these issues. Totally agree.
Yeah.
And I think you've seen that with the diversity of groups that support it. You know, you'll have your pro-carbon tax groups, you'll have your anti-carbon tax groups, you've got your people who want to turn to trade policy, other people who want to use it against the Europeans. I think it produces a really rich, diverse group of stakeholders, and the more we talk like this and exchange ideas, the better off we are.
All right, well, I think we could do like one more question.
We've heard that some offices say that the EPA is already gathering emissions data. Why do we need the Prove It Act?
So that's another good question. Look, EPA doesn't gather comparative data. Okay, so we don't. So again, this is a comparative data set. I mean, so a number of different agencies on the U.S. side would actually provide the data. I mean, EPA obviously being one of probably the most important agency for U.S. data, but you get stuff from Commerce and from state and from the Census Bureau, right? I mean, there are lots of different agencies that will have the data that will be used to assess the U.S. side. Mm-hmm. But again, the number one reason why we're doing this, at least from a Republican perspective, is that we want that comparative data set. And the data that EPA has it just does not get you there. Yeah, and I think I might have this right, that when Dave was talking about comparative data set, he's talking about it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it's greenhouse gas, or I should say intensity related as it relates to foreign competitors and foreign things. So that's the comparative part of the data. Yes, across, a couple of dozen manufacturing sectors. Right. Right. Well, I think this has been a interesting conversation. We can keep going. That'd just keep everybody from the bar. Fair. And I really appreciate you, Dave. We don't always agree on everything. No. But we can certainly have these conversations, and we are happy to have it with you. Well, you can't be right all the time. I certainly try to be, though. But Jen tells me I'm wrong like at least 50% of the time. So that we do have that. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been great to be here today. And, best of luck to all of you, and thank you for what you're doing. Thank you. It's fun. If you do want to stick around, we can grab a drink. Actually...